Chapter 15, Part 4, the lessor and how they deal with direct costs. Now the leasee, it's added to the right of use asset. The lessor, it depends on the type of lease. For an operating lease, it's amortized over the lease term. For a sales type lease with profit, it's expensed as period costs. And sales type lease with no profit, you deferred and expensed over the lease term by including the costs in the lease receivable. Now we'll take a look at an example. All right. The asset has a retail selling price of $100,000, a 6-year life with no residual value. Annual lease payments are at the beginning of each year of $20,873. The leaser's implicit rate is 10%, and they had $2,062 in legal costs executing the lease and were the responsibility of the lessor. So we're going to do examples. What we're going to do is look at what if the lease term was 3 years and the lessor paid $100,000 for the equipment. What if the term of the lease was 6 years, cost the lessor $100,000, and adjusting the lease receivable by the initial direct cost reduces the effective rate to 9%? What if the lease is 6 years and the lessor paid $85,000 to acquire the equipment? So now we'll go through each one of those questions and show how you would record it. So the first is, what if the lease term were 3 years and the lessor paid $100,000 for the equipment? What is the net present value of the lease payments? You always need to figure that out first. So we're going to go present value, the annuity due, because the payment is made when the contract is signed. So N would equal 3 and I would equal 10. And that gives us a factor of 2.73554, and that tells us the net present value is $57,099, which is less than the cost of the $100,000. And the term is 3/6, which is 50%, so it fails all the requirements for a sales type lease, so this is treated as an operating lease. So when the cash and payment of initial costs, it would be cash deferred lease revenue. And remember, the first payment doesn't include any interest revenue because it's made when the lease is signed. So since it's an operating lease, we have to defer the initial direct costs, and we're going to amortize these. And we're looking at, again, from the lessor point of view. What about at the end of the year? Well, we're going to amortize the deferred initial direct costs and book it as an expense. And then we're going to book our deferred lease revenue, and take it out of there and put it as lease revenue. We're also, since this is an operating lease, we're going to depreciate our equipment. Now, what if instead the term of the lease were 6 years, cost the lessor $100,000, and that the adjusting the lease receivable by the initial direct costs of $2,062 reduces the effective rate to 9%? What type of lease? The lease term equals the service life means it's a sales type lease. What type of sales type lease? Does it have profit or it doesn't have profit? So if we look at the net present value of the lease payments, they equal the cost plus the direct cost, so that means this is a sales type lease with no profit because the costs and the net present value of the payments are equal. When the cash is received, you would have lease equipment. So we have to take the equipment off the books and set it up as a lease receivable. So if sales type lease without profit, initial costs are part of lease receivable. So there we booked it to our lease receivable. And then we're going to go cash lease receivable. Because payment at the beginning of the lease, there's no interest revenue for the first payment. And then at year end, we have to accrue the interest portion, which would be $100,000 plus the 2062 minus that first payment times the implied rate of 9%. Next, what if the lease is 6 years and the lessor paid $85,000 to acquire the equipment? What type of lease? Well, first of all, the lease term and the service life are the same, so it's a sales type lease. Next, is it a sales type? What kind of sales type lease? Well, the net present value of the payments are $100,000, which is greater than the cost. So this is a sales type lease with profit. So we book our lease receivable. We take our equipment off the books. We book cost of goods sold, and we book sales revenue. Since it's a sales type lease with profit, we're going to go ahead and expense the selling expense. Now, at the end of the year, we accrue our interest receivable. And that concludes all parts for Chapter 15. I hope this helped you, and if you have any questions, you can always email me.